Okay, totally forgot how I was going to introduce this video. I don't know if I actually had an intro prepared or not, so hey, let's just get into the video then, right? Welcome back to I Want to Talk About, the series where I take a topic, I sit on camera, and I blabber about it. And you know what it is? It's the series within a series, so today, as you can tell from the title, I want to talk about my favorite games of 2016. You know how the series goes. I look at a specific year in gaming, talk about the console gaming landscape, things of that nature, and then when it comes to the games, I talk about some notable snubs, some big games that I didn't play, the just missed the cut games, which were the 7 out of 10 type games that I liked but didn't exactly love, the cream before the crap games, which were games that would be like an 8 or 9 out of 10 on my scale, and then my proper best list of 10 out of 10 games. You know the drill. I don't want to make this intro super long. Let's get right into the video. 2016, the year I started college. As far as I can verifiably prove, because my college doesn't actually exist anymore. And 2016 was a year that had a lot of ups and downs personally and in life as a whole. But in the gaming world, I remember having a lot of fun in 2016, which might be shocking by the end of this video because I won't have as many games to talk about necessarily, but that doesn't mean it was a bad year. Honestly, when it comes to what is a good or bad year in the gaming world, oftentimes to me it's purely a vibes thing, which I know when it comes to discussing video games, you should not necessarily be looking at the vibes, so to speak. But either way, the point is, there were some very good games in 2016 that I'm excited to talk about. Looking at what the console landscape was like, though, in 2016, there was actually quite a bit of excitement, and hardware for that matter. First of all, I think we saw the relative beginning of Xbox's change in approach with the Xbox One, because 2016 was the year they launched the Xbox Play Anywhere initiative, where basically if you buy a game on the Xbox One, you also get it on the PC, and vice versa. You have like one unified profile and save type thing, so you kind of cross-play and interchange the two of them. That was really where Microsoft was kind of merging the PC and Xbox landscape, so to speak. And from this point forward, pretty much every major first-party Xbox title would simultaneously release on PC and Xbox at the same time. So a bit of an ideological shift there, allying itself with the massive PC master race, which obviously shouldn't be too surprising. Microsoft owns the Windows operating system. Oh, and 2016 also happened to be the year that they released the HoloLens. They showed this thing at E3 and they haven't used it for a game once. Probably helps that it costs a metric arm and leg to buy one. As far as their own hardware, all they really dropped in 2016 was the Xbox One S, the Slim revision, which Sony also dropped one of their own with the PlayStation 4 Slim. Those are hardware revisions you would expect in a given year, but Sony took it a step further in 2016 with the release of the PlayStation 4 Pro, essentially kind of ushering in the new half-generation type thing in gaming, because the PS4 Pro was basically, you know, a PS4, but a little bit more powerful. It could play games with slightly better graphics, better frame rate, etc., etc. Now, admittedly, I'm not usually too crazy about these kind of things, but I understand this is more of like a luxury item of sorts for people who have the money to blow on something like this, which is great if you're currently a PS5 player, because that means you can blow $700 on a PlayStation 5 Pro, or whatever the hell it's called. I can't believe that thing is as much money as it is. And 2016 was also a big year for Sony's hardware because it was the year that they released the PlayStation VR. Yes, that's right, this is the first that we'll talk about it, but 2016 was the beginning of the whole VR wave. Not really, I mean, VR had been kind of bubbling up a little bit up to this point, but 2016 was the year where it really started to explode. We had gotten commercial releases for the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, and now Sony was gonna jump on the wave with the PlayStation VR. Project Morpheus, as it once were. And yeah, this was the one console that actually had a virtual reality headset of its own, one that when it launched cost as much as an actual PlayStation 4. Nuts. Now, we'll get into it throughout some of the next few videos, but I actually have a PlayStation VR, and the PlayStation VR 2, which I've talked about a little bit. But yes, I did actually get a PlayStation VR at one point. And it is a very interesting piece of technology, and it is interesting how far we've come in the sense that, you know, comparing this to something like, I don't know, the Virtual Boy is like a night and day difference, obviously. And VR games do actually feel pretty realistic. And even though the PSVR is a kind of weaker version of other VR headsets that you can get on PC, it is nice to have something like this that is a tiny bit, just a tiny bit, more affordable than some of the other stuff that's coming out of the VR space. I think the only issues I had with it were, A, Sony not really putting its best foot forward with first-party IPs on the VR1. It would get worse, though. And the fact that this thing is a bitch and a half to set up because it's got like 2 wires and you gotta plug in a separate box and you gotta plug the power cord into the thing and this and that and the other thing. It's definitely wonky to set up. But it did give me quite a few memories, and I do enjoy quite a few VR games, if only some of them would actually come to the VR2 so that I could use that instead of the VR1. Now, as far as Nintendo was concerned, the 3DS was obviously still trucking along, selling, doing its thing, keeping Nintendo afloat, but the Wii U ended up in a major dry spell in 2016 because it was basically staring down the barrel of its death, as if it wasn't basically dead for a while up to that point. And obviously, it was also staring down the barrel of the impending announcement of Nintendo's next platform. That year at E3, Nintendo literally only showed off one game. I mean, they had other games like available to play there, but there was really only one game being shown off, and that was Zelda, which was supposed to be a big Wii U game, but it had been in development for so long that it would end up coming to Nintendo's next platform, which at the time was just called the NX. And yes, what the NX actually was would be announced in 2016, but I'll save that discussion for the next video. Also, 2016 was the year they released that NES Classic Edition, so that's kind of cute. And then suddenly everyone was jumping on the wave of releasing classic editions of old consoles, so okay, there's that. And as far as third-party stuff, there wasn't a ton of huge things to talk about, but in terms of what I could find, there was Disney Interactive ending its self-publishing efforts, also canceling the Disney Infinity series at the time. And this was pretty sad because as much as people talk about licensed games and this, that, and the third, Disney Interactive was behind quite a few pretty big licensed games from my childhood, and probably the childhoods of many of you, so it was sad to see them kind of end their self-publishing efforts, although we've gotten good Disney games in the time since. There was also IGN acquiring and subsequently shutting down game trailers, which as someone who very much frequented game trailers when I was a kid, very sad. And then the last thing I found was that 2016 was the year that Annapurna Interactive had been established. Yes, a gaming division from a film company. Obviously, by this point in 2016, very artful games were starting to become all the rage. So who better to make artsy games than a company like Annapurna, who was known for funding very artsy films. And don't worry, we will talk about a few Annapurna games as we continue on in this series in the next few videos. With that said, it's time to get on to the games. That intro might have gone a little longer than I wanted it to, but now we can actually talk about the games, and of course we're going to start with some snubs, some big games from 2016 that I didn't play. And there are actually a few. Looking at what I have here, we have Overwatch, which was perhaps the biggest new game of 2016. It was the Game of the Year winner at the Game Awards that year, but I don't really play multiplayer online games like this one, so I don't have a strong opinion on it. There was also Dark Souls 3. You guys know by now how I feel about Souls-like games. I don't play them, so here it is. I'll just mention it because it was a huge game. I mentioned very artsy games earlier, and Inside was one of the games that came out in 2016 that was very huge, but again, I'm not too crazy about these kind of games, so this didn't really do a whole lot for me. There was XCOM 2, which I know was an earlier game that did very well and got rave reviews. If you're into that genre, there's that. I personally am not. And then perhaps one of the biggest cultural moments, let's say, of 2016. I don't usually talk about mobile games on this show, but this time I will talk about one. Pokemon Go. I mean, this game was literally freaking everywhere in 2016. I remember actually that summer vacation, I was doing a pre-college program for my now non-existent college in the summertime, in July, right as Pokemon Go came out. And yeah, you couldn't walk a foot without seeing someone holding their phone out doing this, trying to catch a Pokemon. It was pretty cool, and I know that when it came out, the actual app itself was very flawed. I haven't played it in a long time, though it's my understanding that it's gotten a lot better since, so that's very good. I hope people are still enjoying it. I was just checking my phone to see if I still had it, and I don't. But I do have a Daft Punk soundboard. I need to get that stupid app off my phone because if I keep that shit on there, I'm not going to be able to get anything else done. You won't see it, but I just spent like 2 whole minutes of the raw footage just playing around with it trying to get a good take. Sorry. Let's move on to the Just Missed the Cut games, the games that would have been like a 7 out of 10 on my scale. And we have 3 of them. To blow through them very quickly, we have Star Fox Zero, which I liked more than others did, though I acknowledge it was a very flawed game. thanks to its awkward controls and the fact that it feels like Star Fox 64 again. There was also Mirror's Edge Catalyst, which again I liked more than most others did, though I can acknowledge that it felt like the game was just trying to chase what was popular at the time, and it didn't have the confidence that the first game had. And on the VR front, we have I Expect You to Die, which was a unique little escape room puzzle-like VR game that feels a bit Bond influenced, even if it's nothing close to being the best that the VR offered. Oh yeah, and like I said in the last video, when it comes to remasters that would be in the cream before the crop, we're going to blow through those before we actually get into the proper cream before the crop. This time around, there's not as much to talk about though. There's Batman Return to Arkham, which wasn't the most essential re-release of these games, but it was nice to have them on the current gen consoles. And we also had Call of Duty Modern Warfare Remastered, which was the way that I played through this game when I actually beat it for the first time. And sure, I could talk about this one and the massive set of controversies it rode in on thanks to it being exclusive to the deluxe edition of Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, or Activision adding nickel and diming practices to a game that at the time of release was 9 years old, but let's focus on the new games here. So alright, let's jump into the cream before the crop. There's not a ton of games here, but there are games here that I really enjoy, so let's get right into them. Would you believe that in this instance, I technically get to talk about 2 games in one? That's right, because I played Superhot 2 completely different ways, which some of you probably can say as well. Now, when I first heard about Superhot, it was through the VR version, which I played at an old high school friend's house around 2018. And at the time, it hadn't even dawned on me that it was originally like a flat game. The game felt so perfect for VR, and it felt so built for that world, that I honestly thought it was just a VR game first, and that it was made with VR in mind. Come to find out, there was a flat version released right beforehand. Nevertheless, I did eventually play the flat version, and no matter which version you choose, Superhot is, as the memes all say, the most innovative shooter I've played in years, even though it's not the best shooter that we're going to be talking about in this very video, in my opinion. Essentially though, it's a Matrix meets John Wick kind of game where nothing in the world of the game moves unless you do. It's a very fresh take on the first-person shooter, with a very interesting, subtle story thrown in as well, with some subtle bits of social commentary even kind of tastefully thrown in as well. I also love the minimalist aesthetic that's incredibly striking, and it adds nicely to the overall fascinating feel of the game. Though if I had to recommend one of the 2 versions, I'd have to say the VR version trounces the flat version, just because the concept of the game moving as you do feels so built for the world of virtual reality, and the way the game reads your movement is absolutely perfect. The VR version is definitely a workout, and it's absolutely going to tire you out, but all in all, it is the way to go if you want to play Superhot, in my opinion. Of course, either version of this wild shooter will suit you just fine, but I definitely recommend giving it a spin in VR if you can. It takes the most innovative shooter I've played in years and really ups things to 1,000. Definitely give it a look. And speaking of VR, let's talk about something that's on the complete opposite of the spectrum, tonally speaking, in the VR world. This is the first time in the series that I'm talking about a game with the word simulator in it, but it certainly won't be the last. Obviously, a title like Job Simulator pretty much tells you right off the bat what you're getting into, but yes, it's a game where you simulate the acts of completing certain day jobs. Basically, it's the year 2050 and you have to complete menial jobs that humans once did. A desk job, a cooking job, a clerk job, and an auto mechanic job. It's a very simple concept, one that really speaks for itself. But it works so well because acting these jobs out in VR is just way too much fun. That's kind of the thing that makes VR so good to me, is that it can take these menial things, the ordinary things, and make them feel extraordinary. Like, I'd never want to work a desk job, but with a VR headset on, hell yeah. Not only that, but the developers took advantage of the goofy concept and tacked on loads of absurdist humor into the game, which, as someone who has a fair bit of love for absurdist humor, I cracked up a bunch while playing through it. It's so ridiculous and off the wall that I can't help but go back to it, even though I've beaten the game multiple times and gotten the Platinum Trophy multiple times. I say that because I got the VR1 version, but also ended up grabbing the VR2 upgrade later on, which doesn't seem to change much. You just get a little extra space, so to speak, which shouldn't really change much or make a huge difference, but for me, it kinda does. I mean, it's great no matter which version you play, but that VR2 upgrade to me is worth the grab. I do wish that there was more to the game. It does feel like it could have been expanded on a lot. I know they released a sequel, Vacation Simulator, that I honestly didn't enjoy quite as much. But all in all, Job Simulator is a hilarious VR game and one that I can highly recommend trying out yourself. Make sure you have some friends along the way, because then you'll get to see them watch you be a goofball. Well, you won't get to see them because you're wearing a helmet, but you know what I mean. Now off the VR front for a minute. The epic conclusion, so to speak, of the Uncharted franchise. And I know, I went through this whole series without giving any of them a 10 out of 10. I'm sorry. But again, don't take that to mean that I don't enjoy these games, because Uncharted is freaking awesome. I've been saying this about a lot of games in this series, but I really want to replay the Uncharted games at some point. And Uncharted 4: Thief's End is honestly my favorite of the bunch. It honestly would have been a 10 out of 10 for me if it didn't feel like it kind of slowed down a bit in the back end. But all in all, to me, it's still a fantastic game. While playing it, I feel like I was feeling more of the freshness that Uncharted 3 was kind of missing a little bit. Not that that game was bad, it was very good, it just kind of felt like more of the same. But gameplay-wise, I found this one to be far more enthralling. I know that adding a grappling hook shouldn't be that big of a change, but honestly, I think it makes a world's difference to me, and it makes the game a lot more fun. The story is very emotionally satisfying as well, and even though I'm not one to care about visuals much, this game's graphics were fantastic and really took advantage of the PlayStation 4's power. Probably one of the most impressive games, graphically speaking, of the 8th generation. Naughty Dog has almost always done great work. I feel like you guys know that, I know that. And Uncharted 4 is another prime example of their dominance. As the wrap-up to Nathan Drake's story, they really fired on all cylinders with this one, and made a truly phenomenal game that was well worth the praise it received in 2016. Though, of course, there is going to be one more game to talk about, so it's not really the conclusion of the series. Just let that be known. Before the 3DS rides off into the sunset, we do have one more Kirby game to talk about on it. Granted, we have another game in general to talk about in the next video, but we'll get to that when we get to it. After the success of Kirby Triple Deluxe, Kirby had one more game left in him in the 3DS in the form of this one right here, Kirby Planet Robobot. I actually remember being very excited for this game when I first saw it at the March 2016 Nintendo Direct that it closed out, but it would take a few years for me to actually play it myself. Chalk it up to the whole I don't really play handhelds as much these days thing that I've mentioned in some videos in the past. But when I finally did play the game in early 2020, I definitely had a great time with it. It definitely plays exactly how you would expect a modern Kirby game to play, and it succeeds in a lot of the same areas that Triple Deluxe did, but it adds a touch of extra flavor thanks to Kirby riding around in a mech now. I know that seems so minor, but the mech doesn't just feel like window dressing. It actually plays really well and does wonders for both the combat and the exploration. That alone, to me, gives Planet Robobot the slight edge over Triple Deluxe. I say slight because I enjoyed them both a lot, both were great, but I feel like Planet Robobot was just a touch higher than Triple Deluxe for me. Nevertheless, if you have your 3DS laying around and you haven't played Kirby's 3DS Adventures, I definitely recommend trying them out. They're fun, lightweight little games to play when you need a break from the latest 60-hour Souls-like that you started despite having a 20-game backlog. Come on, why did you do that? We've had this conversation before. You didn't think I'd mention the Battlefield series again, did you? Well, guess what? I got one more left to talk about. And that's it, because it's all downhill from here. But yes, Battlefield 1 was actually quite a big deal in 2016. So much so that, would you believe the game's first trailer was actually the most liked video game trailer on YouTube for a short bit? And the trailer didn't even do anything! It was like a minute-long trailer with barely their gameplay, a remix of that iconic riff from Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, and it ended with a dude who I swore at one point was Rami Malek. But at the time, it was very clear why this was the most liked trailer on YouTube. And it was a very pointed reason. Battlefield was always in a competition with Call of Duty, and at the time Call of Duty was kind of veering off the rails, sticking too close to future warfare, and even going into space, which no one really wanted. And it was also putting a remaster of a game behind a paywall like I was talking about earlier. Fucking stupid-ass decision. Meanwhile, Battlefield 1 gave players what they wanted. A return to boots-on-ground gameplay, this time specifically set in World War I. And I was fascinated enough by that even at a time when I was kind of still getting into first-person shooters and didn't really care for Battlefield, I even played it. It was my first Battlefield game, and after playing it, it really delivered. Even as someone who's more of a single-player shooter guy and a single-player gamer in general, I think the war stories were actually quite cool. Some very emotional stories and compelling characters here with more of the fast-paced gunplay that's aided the best of the Battlefield franchise. And I also thought the World War I setting was pretty fascinating, as it felt like taking things back to that era forced players to kind of work within the constraints of what was available at the time, instead of modding and re-outfitting your gun with all the attachments you could possibly add. Hell, you could even use a shovel as a weapon. I'm easy to please, and I love that. Because I know it's what they used at the time, but there's something funny to me about being in a combat situation and just bonking someone on the head with a shovel. Yeah, even as someone who doesn't really go head over heels for this series, Battlefield 1 was a compelling game that certainly lived up to the pre-release hype. Too bad the same couldn't be said for the entries that immediately followed it. And last in our cream before the crop, yeah, I know, there's only a few. Let's talk about a redemption story. Now, I gloriously skipped over talking about the first Watch Dogs game in my 2014 video because, well, as much as I have a soft spot for that game, it was quite a disappointment and couldn't even make the just missed the cut section. I remember being so excited for that game, and I thought the concept of an open world game centered around hacking was so cool. Hell, you may have seen it before, but I still have my Watch Dogs poster on my wall. That's how excited I was for this game back in the day. As it turned out, the game was kind of a mess, and while it wasn't bad, it certainly didn't live up to that pre-release hype that it had going for it. So when Watch Dogs 2 came along, I was admittedly skeptical, but I jumped in because everyone I talked to about it said it was fantastic. People who hadn't played the first game loved it, and people who did play the first game said it was pretty much a wholesale improvement. And they weren't lying. This game is great. Everything that I didn't like about Watch Dogs 1 was cleaned up in a huge way in this one. San Francisco was such a beautiful, colorful open world to explore compared to the first game's love of gray and grimdark. The hacking mechanics were a bit more complex now, and the writing had so much more charm and personality to it than the first game. I also liked that the stealth sections were much better than that of the first game, and the overall feel was just a massive improvement across the board. Everything about the game was just polished to near perfection, and it really made for a really special game. Sure, it is a little funny to me that Marcus is this moral character with such integrity who can also kill people and cause a bunch of mayhem if he wants. The classic ludonarrative dissonance, if you will. But that contradiction aside, Watch Dogs 2 is a fantastic open world game that I feel doesn't get enough love, even from fans of Ubisoft open world games. I still hear people talking about X Far Cry game or X Assassin's Creed game, but I feel like people don't really talk about Watch Dogs 2. And that makes me kind of sad because I think it's an amazing game and it deserves a lot more love. If you haven't gotten to play this yet, I highly recommend it. Okay, sorry if those sum-ups on the games were a little short. Again, I just didn't want to spend as much time on this video as I currently have. But now onto the best list, though we do have an honorable mention. I know I usually lump remasters together, but if it's a remaster of a 10 out of 10 game, or if the remaster itself is a 10 out of 10, I'll just bring it up as an honorable mention before the best list. So I'll blow through this one as well, but it's Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess HD. You guys know I love Twilight Princess, and the HD re-release was a nice little Wii U dessert before the end of its life. Adding a map was obviously a godsend, and it basically lets this game sit perfectly next to the Wind Waker HD re-release as essential buys for any Zelda fan out there. As I said when I talked about Wind Waker HD, I'd love it if Nintendo could put this and Wind Waker HD out on the Switch, or the Switch 2 ounces? Did I hear something today about the codename being ounces? Nevertheless, this is awesome. Hopefully it comes back on Nintendo's next system. Okay, so for the actual best list, we have 3 games specifically to talk about, starting off at the number 3 spot, a franchise that I've talked about many times in this series, and this is one of my favorites of the bunch, which may be a little bit unpopular, but I'm going with it anyway. I gotta go with Ratchet Clank 2016. This is one of the strangest cases of a game that I've ever seen in my life. It's a video game tie-in to a movie based on a video game. So in essence, it's an adaptation of a video game. Can't wait for the sequel. But yes, in 2016, Ratchet Clank got a movie created by a studio then known as Rainmaker Entertainment, a team that made such acclaimed animated films as We're Doomed. Okay, in all seriousness, I did actually see the Ratchet & Clank movie, and I didn't mind it. I thought it was a fairly decent family flick, though given that I watched it before playing through the games, there's a good chance if I watched it now I might hate it. Also, a little fun fact, this studio was almost going to release a Sly Cooper movie. It got canceled because the Ratchet & Clank movie bombed in the box office. And I can't lie, as a huge Sly Cooper fanboy, I would have been curious. Nevertheless, as a tie-in to the Ratchet Clank movie, Insomniac released a new game in the series based on it because, yeah, that makes sense. As it turns out, though, the foul stench that the movie may have left fans with was washed away by the pleasant smells and aroma of this game. Sorry you even had to think about that. This game to me was just a brilliant revitalization of the series with some of the best gameplay that Ratchet & Clank had put forward up to this point. It was a very great recreation of a lot of the first Ratchet & Clank game, but excellently modernized without losing its identity at all. And while there was a touch of controversy over the changes to the story, I honestly didn't mind them. Sure, you might lose some of Ratchet's arc by making him less of a douche, but I still think they did the character right here. Obviously, also, this game looks utterly beautiful. I mean, it's Insomniac. They're great when it comes to visuals, and the Ratchet & Clank games are, across the board, really beautiful looking games. And yeah, this is just an incredibly polished game that really nails everything that made Ratchet & Clank so special, and it's a perfect game regardless of whether you're a longtime fan or a total newcomer to the series. But if you're a longtime fan and you haven't seen the movie, I suggest staying away from it. Maybe it's for the best that these guys didn't make that Sly Cooper movie happen. I mean, did you see what Murray looked like in it? Yeesh. At number 2, a game that I will never not take an opportunity to swoon about, I gotta go with Titanfall 2. Another feel-good story of 2016 along the lines of Watch Dogs, which feels fitting given that the first Titanfall came out not far off from Watch Dogs 1. Now again, I gloriously skipped over talking about the first Titanfall game in my 2014 video, but I sure do remember when it came out. Not because I played it, but because before release, people were touting it as gaming's next killer app, the next big step in the first-person shooter genre. And being that it was an Xbox One exclusive at the time, everyone was already anointing it as the game to buy an Xbox One for. And then it came out and that reaction turned to, sure, it's good. So when the sequel was announced, again, there was skepticism. But I bought in on the strength that I was hearing that the game was going to have a single-player campaign, and a lot of the reviews I was hearing for it at the time were rave reviews. People were going real head over heels about it. And I'm sure glad that I bought in because Titanfall 2 is one of my favorite first-person shooter games of all time. More than anything, Titanfall 2 is just plain fun. And it's concerned with nothing more than being just that. Fast-paced, fun, and frantic, just how I like my first-person shooters. It controls incredibly well and has some fantastic level design. Look no further than its most iconic level, Effect and Cause. You know you've made an iconic video game level when there's a Wikipedia page dedicated specifically to it. And that level deserves it because it's so clever and inventive, and was especially clever and inventive at the time given where the FPS genre was specifically in terms of single-player FPS games. And sure, the story might be something you can see coming a mile away, but I do think the relationship between Jack and BT was really well fleshed out, and there was great chemistry there, making for a nice bonus on top of the fantastic gameplay that this offered. It's a shame this game went pretty underrated when it came out and didn't sell quite as well as it could have because it was sandwiched between Call of Duty and Battlefield, but all things considered, Titanfall 2 is absolutely phenomenal. If you haven't played it, please do. It's really an incredible game, definitely deserves a lot more love than it got. It's a crowning achievement for Respawn and one of the best things that EA has ever published. Now, if only they let Respawn make Titanfall 3, or not cancel that Star Wars FPS game that they were working on. I mean, come on, that sounded awesome. I mean, I'm not even a Star Wars fan, and I was hyped for that. Why did it have to get canceled? But it's funny, because as much as I say that Titanfall 2 is one of my favorite first-person shooters of all time, there's one first-person shooter that came out in 2016 that I liked more than it. And now that I'm saying that, you probably already know where I'm going with this. But yes, my favorite game of 2016, my game of the year, it really couldn't be anything other than Doom 2016. You had to know with how much I love this series that Doom 2016 was going to end up on this list somewhere, and would you believe this was actually my first step into the series? Chances are the answer is yes, but nevertheless, it was. Again, I didn't grow up with Doom because, as I mentioned in my last video, as a child, good, clean, rule-abiding Christian boy. But back in 2016, my close friend Dave, who I used to do Let's Plays with on my old channel, got the game at launch and started doing a Let's Play of it on his old channel, which I sat in for on a few videos. I was really intrigued by the game after having seen it at Bethesda's E3 show in 2015, and even as someone who wasn't really that into FPS games at the time, I just thought it looked positively enthralling. Eventually, my brother would get it for Christmas that year, and I started playing it myself. And I distinctly remember in my first play session not wanting to put the game down. I was just that hooked. And Doom was the game that truly made me stop being so cynical toward first-person shooters. For a while as a kid, I was just like, shooters are overrated, screw shooters, they're bad, blah, 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 without actually playing them, you know, that hard-headed mentality. But it was Doom 2016 that made me give first-person shooters a much greater chance, because it's just such a phenomenal game. It perfectly captures what made Doom such a compelling series in the first place, and it's an absolutely rip-roaring good time. Unbelievable visuals, fantastic level design, superb shooting, badass weapons. I mean, this game really has it all. I've played through the game too many times to count, even playing the version that came out on the Nintendo Switch. Yeah, I couldn't keep it in anymore, I had to say the name once. But yes, I even played the game in its impossible port form on the Nintendo Switch, even playing most of it in handheld mode. I know you're wondering how I made it out alive, but you know what? I still enjoyed it in that form. Even with the lower frame rate, even as someone who prefers better frame rates, prefers 60 frames per second, that played it mostly handheld, I still managed to enjoy my time with it on the Switch. Of course, it's best on literally any other platform, but I still enjoyed playing it in its handheld form on the Switch. I actually just completed another playthrough of it earlier this year, and even with what came after this from the Doom series, this is still one of my all-time favorite games, and it's a game I absolutely love to go back to. Even its sequel Outdoing It doesn't stop it from being an absolutely incredible game, and one I'd recommend to even the most ardent non-enjoyers of first-person shooter games. I was one of you before, but it was this game that really broke me out of that stubborn mentality, and I would only further break out of it as time went on. And you bet your ass that when Doom the Dark Ages comes out next year, I will be seated for that game. Maybe my most anticipated game of next year. I just can't wait to play it. So yeah, that's 2016. Again, maybe I'm grading more off vibes than the sheer number of games, but 2016 is one of those years that I like looking back on when it comes to games. Even with a lower quantity of games, the quality of the games were so high, and I have such good memories with them that I look back very fondly on that year. But get ready, because 2017, relatively speaking, is gonna explode. As of right now, the raw footage on this camera is about 51 minutes. I'm terrified to know what it's gonna look like in the 2017 video. I might have to just sum up every game in one sentence, honestly. Not really, but you know what I mean. Either way, this is all just my opinion on 2016 as a year in gaming. What did you guys think of 2016? What were your favorite games of the year? What were some games that you played that I didn't mention, because I'm sure there are plenty? And obviously, I like to ask a question specific to a given video, and I'll ask this one. We talked a bit about VR gaming in this video because of the PlayStation VR and things like that. What's your experience with VR gaming? Do you have any? Do you have a VR headset yourself? Have you played VR anywhere? Do you think VR gaming is the future? Because I don't, even as someone who has a VR headset, I don't think it's the future. But whatever your thoughts, opinions, and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal, I totally understand. And yeah, next time I see you guys after this video, I'm going to be doing the 2017 video, which again, to me, one of the best years in gaming, and I am very excited to talk about that year, but I feel like that video is going to be very long, so hopefully I can get it out to you guys relatively soon. So stay tuned for that, but until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace. But I do have a Daft Punk soundboard. Fuck! But I do have a Daft Punk soundboard. No, I can't look at the camera. I can't look at the camera as I'm doing it because I can't see. But I do have a Daft Punk soundboard. Can't do it. This is gonna be half the video.